Okay everyone, so today we're out here at the Equine Center and I want to talk to you a little bit more about aperture. Okay, we discussed exposure last week and what a correct exposure was, whether something was underexposed or overexposed, and now we're starting to break apart each piece of the exposure triangle. And so that first segment that we're really discussing in much more detail is aperture. Okay, remember, aperture is that diaphragm inside this lens right here. Okay, and basically as we increase the aperture to a larger aperture, smaller number, so something like f2.8, extremely large aperture, wide opening inside this lens, lets in lots of light, and it's also going to give us a very shallow depth of field. Remember, depth of field is the area of that photo that's in sharp focus from near to infinity. With a very large aperture, we have a very shallow depth of field, very small area that's in sharp focus. With a very small aperture, something to the other extreme, f16, f22, remember that we have a great depth of field. Okay, you think about that landscape photo that we can look at of the mountains back here, and we'll take some examples here in a bit and show you the differences between those aperture. Okay, but it's crucial that you gain an understanding of each of these three elements of the exposure triangle: aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. Now we'll go into much more detail on shutter speed and ISO at a later time, though obviously they're going to come into play with discussion a little bit today. Okay, and so I've got my digital SLR with me. We're going to go through, we're going to end up shooting a few photos, talk to you about some different settings on this camera. I've shooting with a Nikon camera. Doesn't matter if it's Nikon, Canon, another brand of digital SLR. Nikon and Canon obviously rise to the top, but there's many other good cameras out there. If you have trouble finding something on settings, by all means let me know. I'm happy to point out where that might be. I'm shooting with a telephoto lens. This is a 70 to 200 millimeter lens. I shoot with this more than probably any other lens, and I really do like this, especially for a lot of equine photography. This is absolutely my favorite lens. I don't care if I'm shooting in the arena here and some horses are loping around, or they're jumping, or I'm at a show, or wherever else. Sometimes you may need a little more reach, but for many purposes, this does just fine. Okay. Now, when we talked about aperture, okay, we reminded you a little bit on that large aperture. Again, it's a fraction, so f2.8, think of 1/2 is greater than, say, a 1/2 inch, 1/32 of an inch, so f22. Okay, and so just remember it as that fraction. Very small aperture, f22, very large aperture, f2.8. When we talk about that large aperture, I told you that big opening in the lens right here. Remember, that lets in lots of light. Okay, and so what also comes with a very large aperture is what? Fast shutter speeds. Okay, and so that's the cool thing that is also advantageous for us in shooting equine photography, is I can get very fast shutter speeds. Okay, and so we'll just meter off real quick. And so I've got my lens hood on today. There's some sun out, try to reduce any lens flare. I carry a cleaning cloth with me. It's in my pocket, especially in some dusting settings. I can clean off the front of this lens, or especially that UV filter, as I showed you, is on the front of all of these. Okay, and so if we just metered off the light right now, I've got my ISO. I'll show you the settings on this camera up close in a moment, but I've got my ISO 100. It's a bright sunny day. At aperture of f5, I'm at a shutter speed of about 1/1000th of a second. More than enough to freeze frame. Okay, heaven forbid I go even larger. If I go down to f2.8, I'm at a shutter speed right now metering at 1/3200th of a second. Okay, extremely fast. Okay, you listen and it's just you can't even tell. Okay, and so if we're talking about horses galloping down a track, that 1/3200th of a second is more than enough to be able to freeze frame. And so the advantage to that larger aperture, I can get a shallow depth of field, but I can also freeze frame easier. That's more than I need. Okay, the other thing you have to be careful of with horses, and we'll go through and we'll shoot some examples today, and I'll show you some extremes of things, is you got to be careful that you don't get too shallow a depth of field. Okay, and so with a person, if I'm standing like this and you're taking again a photo of me, it's really tough to have my nose in focus and my eyes out. Okay, because I'm on such a shallow plane right here. But a horse is long. Okay, and so if they are standing directly at you, or 3/4 angle, or whatever that might look like, because of the length of their head and the length of their body, It's very easy if you have a shallow depth of field, especially I've got this set on f2.8 right now, to have maybe eyes in focus and the nose out, or opposite of that, nose in, maybe eyes are out of focus, and that's not what you want, okay? Or maybe you have the entire head in focus and the body falls out, and maybe that's okay, but just realize, again, you can't have too shallow of a depth of field where it's no longer appealing, and so make sure you are playing with that, okay? As we go through talking about things today and I show you some examples, remember in the beginning as you're learning, you can always refer back to some of those depth of field calculators. You can go on any Apple Android phone, download a DOF calculator, and it will start to give you an idea of how much of that area in the photograph is going to be in sharp focus, okay? You can set it on the focal length, you can set your distance between you and the subject, and also your aperture, and it's going to give you all those parameters, okay? And so as we say that, remember, we'll go through and we'll shoot some photos today. There are three main things that are affecting depth of field. One is that aperture you choose. We keep talking about that large aperture f2.8, very shallow depth of field, small aperture f22, very great depth of field. But there's two other things that you'll remember that affect depth of field as well, one of which is focal length, okay? I like this lens, I love this lens, but on 200 millimeters, when I'm zoomed in looking through this viewfinder, again, I can get a much shallower depth of field zoomed in on something at 200 millimeters than I can at 70 millimeters, okay? The other thing that changes, and you'll see some as we go around and shoot here today, is my distance between me and the subject. If I'm right close to a horse and I zoom in, okay, and all of a sudden I look at them, I'm going to be a lot easier to be able to blow out that background if the distance between me and the subject is close. As all of a sudden I zoom in on, say, the big building down there, the CDC, okay? It's so far away from me. I can have f2.8 of an aperture. I'm not going to be able to blow out those mountains behind it, okay? It's too far away from me, okay? And so the distance between me and the subject, that's one extreme to the other, but that's also going to change depth of field, okay? And so our main focus today is that you know how to adjust aperture and what it does as a result to your photographs, okay? And I want you to have more enriching, creative photographs that you are adjusting the aperture as you want. You are in control, okay? And so let's go through. I'll give you a bit more of a close-up now. Let's go through and I'll show you some of the settings on this camera, what I'm going to set it to, what you might set it to in the future, and then we'll go over and we'll start taking some photographs of some horses and maybe some other scenes just to show you some examples all the way through. And so let's look at the camera settings in a bit more detail. Okay, everyone, so I've got the camera now set up in front of the actual video camera, and I just want to go over a few things with you, okay? You can see a few things. You can see this A that sits right here. This stands for Aperture Priority. Again, I bet you probably 80–85% of the time I shoot in Aperture Priority, okay? What that does is it means that I set the aperture and I set the ISO. The camera is going to then adjust the shutter speed that is listed right there to give me a correct exposure, okay? Now, we talked about things being a little under, over. The camera is not always perfect, but for the most part, we can probably make minor adjustments in post-processing, okay? And so if I'm just a hair underexposed or over, we can go back and change it after the fact. If it's drastic, we could do something in the settings with exposure compensation, or we could go completely to manual and be able to adjust it. And so I just wanted to show you, I really do love this top display on this camera and a lot of other models, okay? The D7000 series of Nikon shows you this top display as well, and it shows you all three elements of the exposure triangle, which is really key. You can see as I push down the shutter button halfway, it continues to then meter and wake up these settings right here. And so all of a sudden I push halfway and it's metering and it's waking this up. And so this right here is my aperture. As you can tell, f2.8 is what it is set on now. This front dial is going to change that aperture. Again, I'm in control of that. You can see how my shutter speed changes as a result. What happens if my aperture gets smaller? As I go f9, so on, our shutter speed is slowing. 1/125th of a second, 1/100th of a second, 1/80th of a second. ISO is not changing, okay? But as the aperture gets smaller, it lets in less light, and as a result, the shutter has to stay open for a longer period of time, okay? And so that's what's changing here. I also like to set my camera settings to what we call an easy ISO. And so if I'm in a priority mode, like we are right now, I can adjust the aperture, and on the ISO, the camera adjusts the shutter speed. if this is in a priority mode, the front dial is doing aperture, and my back dial now does ISO, okay? And so it makes it very easy for me to be able to adjust. I can see these same 3 settings through the actual camera viewfinder while I'm taking photos to keep an eye on that, okay? And so all of a sudden the clouds move over a little bit, I need a faster shutter speed, I can bump up my ISO to 320, 400, and get a little bit faster shutter speed. You can see that shutter speed go up as all of a sudden I increase my ISO and I make that camera sensor more sensitive to light, okay? And so you guys can see those settings right here, okay? If I want to put it in manual, we're going to talk about shutter priority later, but if I want to put it in manual, you can see one roll of this back dial with a mode button changes it to that. Now I have to control all 3 settings, and it's going to give me a meter to tell me I'm incredibly overexposed right now. But if all of a sudden I increase my shutter speed, I bet you can see this, that starts to move back to the center, okay? And so right now you can see that bar, I am completely, what's basically according to the light meter is a correct exposure, okay? And so f5, 1/25 of a second, ISO 500, okay? I decrease my ISO, you can see I'm overexposed a little bit again. I can start to, again, change things. Well, let's do ISO. So if I all of a sudden take my ISO lower to say 200, now all of a sudden, again, we're in good shape, okay? We can start to watch that light meter on either side and get it back to the center in manual. So it's a little bit tougher with changing light scenarios to be sure that light meter is dead center and that our picture is going to be correctly exposed. So again, I really do like these priority modes. This is back to that aperture priority, okay? And so I shoot in this quite a bit, okay? But I want you to see those settings and what you can do. So push halfway, and I can roll and I can change aperture. This lens goes from f2.8 all the way to the other extreme of f22, like I was discussing with you. And so vast range in aperture. I can do a lot to change the depth of field as well. And so I think with that, everything else is set on this camera. We are pretty well good to go. We'll discuss more camera settings at a later time, but now all I have to do is push halfway to meter, push all the way to take a photo. Let's go look at some examples and start shooting some photographs. Okay everyone, so we're over here in one of our horse pens. I just want to be able to start taking a few photographs for you and showing you the difference in large aperture versus small aperture, how it's also going to change shutter speed, and how it's going to change the look of the photo and the depth of field in the photo. Again, remembering that large aperture, f2.8, very shallow depth of field, small aperture, f22 on the opposite extreme. We might not go to that right this moment, but realizing that small aperture, very great depth of field, okay? A lot more in focus within that photograph, okay? And so I want to show you through the viewfinder here, make sure you guys can see the settings, because I think that is important. Now there's a lot of other settings on this camera that I have adjusted. I realize that. If you have questions on anything, feel free to ask. In time, more of that will make sense. My really hope today is that you understand aperture more than anything else. So one more thing I want to remind you guys of today is just proper etiquette when it comes to holding the camera and making sure you do that correctly, okay? I've got a telephoto lens on here right now. And so again, with that telephoto lens, it's big, okay? We don't want to hold everything all the way back on the camera body, okay? And so remember, we're going to hold from the bottom, okay? And right here I got my hand on the zoom ring, and so I can look through the viewfinder just like so, zoom in on a subject, go in and out, but I'm supporting it from the bottom of the actual lens, okay? And so of course the horses want to know what we're doing today as well, and so we will take some photos of them here momentarily. But again, proper etiquette, holding it from the bottom. We've got one finger on our shutter right here, our shutter button. We can push halfway, meter. I can see the settings through the viewfinder. I can make sure I frame my subject, get my focus point where I want, and then pull the trigger, okay? But I'm supporting underneath that lens, not holding it just like this, okay? All the way underneath that lens, and then again, framing our subject. And so with that, let me show you through this viewfinder right now. Okay, so now you can see through the viewfinder. This is how you should be looking when you are taking photographs, through the viewfinder, not at the LCD screen on the back through a live view. I can move my focus point around as I push halfway, put it on something, but when I push halfway, you can see all of the settings on the bottom of that viewfinder, my aperture, ISO, and shutter speed, okay? It's important that while I'm taking photographs, I'm in control of that and I can see what those settings are. And so now let's go ahead and take a few photographs, and I'll show you one extreme to the other. Okay, so now that you've seen in the viewfinder, I want to show you a few examples of photos so you can see the adjustment and the change in depth of field as a result of us changing the aperture. Again, this is what I want you guys to be in control of as you're taking photos. Yes, we know you get a fast shutter speed with a large aperture because you let more light in. These horses are moving around a whole lot right now, so I don't need a crazy fast shutter speed, but I do want to show you one extreme to the other, okay? And so right now I've got it set on f2.8, as large as this camera will go, and ISO 200. It's a bright sunny day, but I got it up to 200 just so that we have a little bit faster shutter speed as I start to make it smaller, okay? And so with this, I'm going to take two photos at f2.8 so you can also see the difference in change in focal length and how that might affect our photograph. And so we've got a horse standing out here at the photo. We'll take one photo at f2.8 with a focal length of 70, and then another one at f2.8 with a focal length of 200 millimeters, okay? And so here, we'll go ahead and frame this. We'll take a photo. Now if you look at that, we're zoomed out, we see whole horse, that's f2.8. Not as much of the background is blown out. Let's zoom in to 200 millimeters, okay? Now we'll go ahead and take a photo. Now look at that, and the entire background is blown out, okay? And you can see that shallow depth of field, okay? We could take another one in a different orientation, so we've got it vertical now. And again, you can tell that the entire background is blown out. It's no longer distracting elements of perhaps those houses in the background, etc. Okay, let's go to the opposite extreme. Okay, we're not going to be able to go all the way to f22 because again, we don't have a tripod right now. We're just hand holding, and so it looks like probably the fastest we're going to be able to take this photo, or the smallest aperture that we're going to be able to take this photo is about f14 or so. Okay, at f14 it's going to give us a shutter speed of close to about the minimum that we can handhold, and we'll talk about some of those minimum constraints here shortly, and then go from there. Get out of here. And so we'll take our same photo over here. Now we'll do it at 70 millimeters. Okay, you're going to see a lot more in focus now, a greater depth of field. Now let's zoom in back to 200. Okay, and so with this horse now, we zoom in to 200. We take a photo. We're not going to get a head up, but that's okay. There it is. There it is. Okay. And so now you can see much more in focus within that photograph with a greater depth of field at f14 as compared to that f2.8. Okay, and so that's just one of those things that hopefully you guys have picked up on as we start to change the settings from one extreme to the other. Okay, I've got this horse sitting over here. Again, we'll zoom in to quite a bit. We'll see what we can get out of it. f3.2. This one's way more interested in the camera than the other one. And so we'll let him walk off for here for a second. And we'll take a photograph. He'll stand there. Okay. So that's going to give us a nice photograph, and I'll show you those right here. Now you can see those on the screen. And again, you can see I got a shallow depth of field. I also get a cool background because of where this horse is standing. So you can get some really, again, intriguing elements with ears up. And again, shallow depth of field. Okay, we'll stand over here so we get more mountains in the background. Again, shallow depth of field. So hopefully you guys understand the difference between large aperture and small aperture, how that affects your depth of field. You can see I'm much closer to this horse than I was that horse over there. We take another photo of this horse now that we can see majority of the body. And so we're at f3.2. Now we are f16. Same frame. We did not change focal length there at all. And you can see the difference in those two shots. Okay, and so hopefully again you got a little bit better grasp of aperture, how changing that might affect your photograph in the end. Let's go take a few more photos in a different location just to emphasize the change in aperture a little bit and what we can do. Okay. So I just want to show you guys real quick a different scene or two. We'll also go in a low light scenario, and then I'll show you a landscape. But we'll take a picture of these guys right now and just see the difference in the changing of our depth of field because of our aperture. And so right now I'm at ISO 100, aperture set on 3.2. Gives us plenty of shutter speed in terms of how fast it is. So let's take a picture of these guys right here. Again, you can see that shallow depth of field that comes out. If you saw those distracting elements in the background, it wouldn't be nearly as pleasing. So let's do just that, okay? Let's all of a sudden go to F10. And again, now you can see much more in the background, okay? Which one of those looks more appealing to you, okay? Let's take it at this angle, okay? Now, you guys can start to see it starts to almost be too shallow. We're at f2.8, but I almost lose that horse in the background, okay? And so let's go to something like f5.6, okay? And so now, let's take a picture of this guy, okay? Take a picture of this one here, okay? You guys can see that background and how it changes a little bit, okay? If we try to get both of these horses maybe in a photograph at one time, see if we can frame it as such. Right now we've got the front one in focus, back one's probably out, okay? We can easily change that by what our aperture is set on, okay? And so hopefully that gives you a little bit better idea of some settings that you guys can play with, adjust that aperture, have fun with it, but start to become more familiar with it as well. Let's look at a low light scenario. Okay, y'all, and so before we go back outside, I wanted to show you one other scenario, okay? Some of the photographs that you might take of horses at various shows or events or any other circumstance might be in a low light scenario, okay? We'll see this again with shutter speed. It's going to come into play, but we're standing inside an indoor arena right now, and it may not seem like it, but it's an incredibly low light scenario as compared to outside with the vast amount of sun that we have. And so when you're looking at our camera settings, just like we had outside, if we look on the top here, we're at ISO 100 still, f2.8 on our aperture, and we're metering about 1/8 of a second, okay? That's way too slow to even handhold, and with these horses moving around in here, even in a walk, they're going to be a blur, okay? And so we have to get a faster shutter speed, okay? And so we can use that large aperture to our advantage, but we also have to increase our ISO, make that camera sensor more sensitive to light. And so first thing I'm going to do in here is up our ISO. I'm going to put it at 2500 right now, and I'm going to change our aperture to f3.5 just so I'm not so incredibly shallow, okay? And so we'll take a picture of this horse right here, okay? And you can see we still blow out a little bit of the background there, okay? But when we take these photos, okay, even as these horses are moving around, again, we still have a moderately fast shutter speed, okay? I'm going to up our ISO even more. We'll put it at 4000, okay? And now we will change our aperture to 3.2, okay? And so when we meter, we have 1/250th of a second, which for a horse walking around should be more than enough, okay? And so now realizing these horses are pretty far away from us, okay? And so blowing out the background is going to be tough, okay? As they become closer to us and the distance between me and that horse or the subject is closer, I can blow out that background even more, meaning I can get an even shallower depth of field. But I want you guys to understand low light scenarios like this. You're probably going to want to max out your aperture. It might be 5.6. You probably won't have any problems being too shallow with something like that. But we can continue to take photos in here and make sure we have a fast enough shutter speed, okay? And so, again, good examples of low light. Okay, everyone, so kind of the last thing I want to show you is that far opposite extreme. Say we change up our shot. Really, what we were doing over in the pens would be considered an isolation or singular theme, taking a picture of those horses with a shallow depth of field, okay? We did do some with a greater depth of field. Tells a little bit more of a story of them in the pen, mountains in the background. You can see where the equine center is at, etc. And I want to show you just that full-fledged landscape and how we might have to change things up a little bit. And so let's take a picture of this right back here, and I'll show you how we might do that with a setup, okay? Okay everyone, so I'm going to show you how we might set up to do a landscape shot like this, and you can see that I've got this camera now sitting on a tripod. Okay, I've changed lenses. We now have a different lens on, a shorter lens. This is a 24 to 70 millimeter lens, just fine for what we're going to take a photo of this landscape. We could go even wider angled if we really wanted to. We could put our 14 to 70 on. One thing just to remember as we changed out this lens a little bit ago is make sure we're not doing it in dusty conditions. Okay, you really don't want to get any dust buildup or debris inside this lens or inside the camera body. Okay, and so make sure you do change that out in a clean environment. Also, when you're changing out that lens, remember to have the camera off, change it out, then you can kick it back on. Okay, so we've got this set up on a tripod. Why, you might ask? Well, we're going to do a landscape shot of this, and just for purposes we're going to put this on f/22. We'll take one at f/16 as well. And so if you were to look down at these camera settings that you guys can see right here, if I push halfway, you can see we're at f/22 ISO 100, and our shutter speed is 1/50th of a second. Okay, that 1/50th of a second right there is just about the bottom end of being able to handhold, and so we got it on a tripod just so that we don't have any camera shake. Okay, and so that's going to be to our advantage to be able to stabilize this a little bit. Okay, now we have a trigger release that we could go get out of the truck, especially if we had a lot slower shutter speed. For the purposes today, this will be just fine. And so we're going to go ahead, and I've already framed our shot, push halfway on the shutter, let it meter, and then all the way down. Now you can see that photo as it's taken at f/22. Okay, now just to see if I can't go in a little bit just to show you guys through this viewfinder what that shot may look like. Okay, and it looks like you guys can maybe see a little bit of that, and again you can see those camera settings hopefully on the bottom. Again, it's a little bit bright through that camera lens right now just because of the angle. Okay, but that's where I want you looking through that viewfinder right there. Now you can see it a little bit better. Okay, and so let's roll this to f/16. Okay, and remembering how we do that, again, all we have to do to be able to change up those settings is roll that front dial to we'll do 16 in this case. Again, it puts our shutter speed at 1/100th of a second now, ISO at 100. Okay, and so now we could look back through that viewfinder. We kind of like the way that it's framed still, and we can go ahead and click our shutter button. Okay, and you'll see that now. And so we've got that landscape framed nicely, and hopefully you guys can see how that tripod might be advantageous again when you're shooting something with a slower shutter speed, smaller aperture, and really taking advantage of that landscape shot. We've got some horses out in those pens feeding right now. We've got the buildings in the background, the mountains, so a bit more of a storytelling image right here than we had of those shallow depth of field horses kind of close up. And so with that, I hope you guys have learned a good bit today about aperture. Maybe you've gained a better understanding about that diaphragm inside the lens that opens and closes as you adjust aperture. Okay, again, reiterating, that large aperture f 2.8, shallow depth of field, very narrow area of that photograph in sharp focus. Small aperture f/16 up to f/22, again very small, lets in a little bit of light, slower shutter speeds, great depth of field, much more in your photograph is in sharp focus, essentially from this camera now to infinity when we have that sitting at f/22. And so with that, we'll continue to elaborate in the future on shutter speed, ISO, again composition, and a whole lot more in terms of technique, but you should be well versed in this topic. So with that, have a great rest of your day, and we'll talk to you soon.